While not legally sanctioned in the United States, the World Health Organization endorses the safety of self-managed medication abortion. And unfortunately, we do not know how many people in the United States are currently self-managing their abortions. The overwhelming majority of abortion patients express high certainty about their decision. While emotions vary, most people express relief following an abortion. There is no widespread abortion regret. What causes people to struggle emotionally after an abortion includes experiencing social disapproval, the loss of a romantic relationship, not feeling like it was their decision, or a conflict between their head, what they knew they had to do, and their heart, what they wish they could have done. Restrictions on access to abortion disproportionately impact people already marginalized by systems of structural oppression. The greatest barrier to care is gathering the money to pay for it. Passed in 1976 and then annually thereafter, the Hyde Amendment prohibits federal Medicaid funds from covering abortion care. Only 17 states use their state funds to pay for abortion, and as a result, most people pay out of pocket for abortion care. The cost is prohibitive, as the average price for abortion ranges from $500 for medication abortion to $15,000 for a late abortion. To pay for abortion, people do not pay rent, utility bills, or child-rearing expenses. About 1 in 4 people receive help from a nonprofit organization known as an abortion fund. One of these funds, the DC Abortion Fund, will share their work with you during the reception. However, many people never make it over the finish line, and research finds that in states without Medicaid coverage, between 20 and 25% of low-income residents never obtain their abortions. The next biggest barrier is travel, as there are only about 750 abortion-providing facilities remaining in this country. Not obtaining a desired abortion has significant economic consequences, including lower credit scores, as well as increased debt, bankruptcy, and evictions. Women denied abortions are more likely to stay in contact with a violent partner. They are more likely to be raising the resulting child alone, and their financial well-being and development of current and future children are negatively impacted. But denials of care are not new. A decade before Dobbs, my colleagues and I calculated that over 4,000 people a year were turned away from an abortion providing facility, mostly because they were over the state's gestational limit. And many more people likely never made it to the clinic because they learned about the state's limit when they tried to make an appointment. As Professor Mutcherson, welcome, will expand upon, the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision recognized the state's interest in fetal life, which allowed states to establish these gestational limits. At the time of Dobbs, 43 states had laws on the books severely restricting abortion after this point. These laws did allow physicians to perform abortions if they believed the pregnancy threatened the health or life of the pregnant person. My colleagues and I have shown that doctors make decisions about to whom to offer these abortions based on whether those people perform appropriate gendered or maternal scripts. Now, sociologists have long documented that criteria of deservedness negatively impact those structurally disadvantaged by race, immigration status, age, gender identity, and socioeconomic status. Abortion is likely no different. Since Dobbs, we have heard more about the denials of these kinds of abortions. Indeed, President Biden has just invited one of the women to be his guest at the State of the Union. As Professor Kaplan will discuss tonight, why these new cases of abortion denial have captured the public imagination reflects long-standing ideas of stratified reproduction built on the legacy of control over Black women's reproduction. So this story of numbers and the grim reality under Roe and exacerbated by Dobbs requires us to imagine a new pathway forward. As Ms. Tracy Sherman will tell us, liberation is possible, but it requires us to center the voices and experience of the vast diversity of people who have abortions. So enough of the stats and statistics, and I am thrilled to introduce our speakers and move to the more generative part of this program. Kim Mutcherson is an award-winning professor of law at Rutgers University. Her scholarship focuses on reproductive justice, bioethics, and family and health law. She has presented her scholarship nationally and internationally and publishes extensively on assisted reproduction, abortion, bioethics, family, and the law. She was a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Center of Bioethics and the Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Professor Mutcherson is the immediate past dean of the Rutgers Law School. As you heard, Sara Clarke Kaplan is the executive director of the AU Anti-Racism Research and Policy Center. She is also an associate professor of literature and of critical race, gender, and cultural studies. She is a scholar of Black and women of color feminist and queer thought, Black literary and cultural studies, and reproductive politics. The author of The Black Reproductive, Unfree Labor and Insurgent Motherhood from University of Minnesota Press, Dr. Kaplan's current research examines the race and gendered politics of what she names reproductive carcerality in and leading up to the post-Dobbs moment. Her work on this project has recently appeared in Women's Studies Quarterly special issue of State and Power. And finally, Renee Tracy Sherman is a reproductive justice activist, abortion storyteller, and a writer. She is the founder of the executive director of We Testify, an organization that shares organization dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions and share their stories at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. She is the co-host of the A-Files, A Secret History of Abortion, a podcast from Medio, and executive producer of Hours to Tell, an award-winning documentary elevating the voices of people who've had abortions. She is the co-author of the forthcoming book on the history and future of people of color's experience with abortion from HarperCollins, expected out in fall of 2024. Please welcome our speakers.
I'm literally going to be having nightmares for decades about being late for this event. I'm never, ever late. This is very stressful for me. But I'm here and really glad to be here with these amazing folks and having been invited by Tracy and seeing some of my favorite people in the room. So I'm excited to have this conversation today and to get started. Let me just start my timer because that's the kind of person that I am and I don't want to the gall to arrive late and then take up too much time, right? Okay, now I can get my timer started. Oh my God, I'm falling apart, everybody.
So get a load of this.
Right? Get it together. All right. So my piece of the puzzle here is to bring some of the law lens onto our conversation, in particular, to think about the ways in which Roe, followed by Casey, and the emphasis on viability and the state's interest in potential life, has significant repercussions and is one of the reasons why going back to Roe should not excite any of us, right? Roe was never the best thing that we could get, and it's certainly not the best thing that we can get now. One of the things that I did get to do as an academic several years ago is participate in a project called the Feminist Judgments Project. And it's really fun because it basically allows you to take cases that were decided by the Supreme Court and rewrite them with a feminist lens. And I rewrote Roe versus Wade because there's a lot that can be done to make that case a better case. And I want to talk about some of the things that I did in rewriting that case. So first of all, if you've never read Roe versus Wade, one of the things that might be surprising to you is that women almost feel like an afterthought in the case, and the way, which is amazing given how much reverence we give to the case. It focuses very much on the idea of doctors being able to help their patients make decisions about abortion. It has basically no equality lens to it, and really thinking about how pregnancy has an impact on a pregnant person's ability to make choices and to move through the world. So that in and of itself was a problem. But the big thing that Roe did is it created this trimester system of how states could choose to regulate abortion. And what the court said in Roe was basically in the first trimester, states essentially can't regulate at all, right? It's none of your business, leave everybody alone. In the second trimester, states can regulate, but they can regulate for the health of the pregnant woman. And I'll use the term woman because that's all that was used in Roe, for the health of the pregnant woman. And then in the third trimester, basically at the point of viability, at least as the court described it, the state can go as far as to ban abortion altogether, but they have to have an exception for the life and health of the pregnant person. That was the only constitutional requirement. So people, I think, often think that rape and incest requirements were required constitutionally. Never, right? So it was always the case that a state could decide not to have rape and incest requirements. So viability essentially became this line between when states could regulate and when states could go so far as to actually ban access to abortion. And viability from the beginning was always going to be something that fell apart. It had to, right? And had to fall apart for a number of reasons. One, what courts do a lot, and certainly what we've seen state legislators do a lot, is pretend like they have expertise that they don't have. And this was very, very true in the context of Roe. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the opinion, had worked at the Mayo Clinic and sort of fancied himself some sort of physician, which he was not. And so the idea was we will use this viability thing because it's so clear and it's so precise, and we'll always be able to figure out where regulation should happen. I'm being very serious here. This is really serious stuff. And so basically, what the court did there is it created a space for states to regulate, right? It said there is some point in a pregnancy where a state's interest in potential life is essentially equal to, if not greater than, the interest of the pregnant person in not being pregnant any longer. So we were always sort of rocked back on our heels from the very beginning of abortion being a constitutional right in this country. And there are sort of a few different reasons why this is problematic. So first of all, the word viability means more than one thing in the context of how healthcare providers think about that word. So viability might just be, is a pregnancy expected to progress normally, right? You're expected to remain pregnant. And then, of course, the way that viability is used in the law or has been used in abortion law is this a fetus that can survive outside of the womb, outside of the uterus, if it were to be born now? And that range of survivability was always going to be a shifting line, but I'll give you just some percentages now. So at 23 weeks, the survivability basically of a fetus is 23 to 27%. At 24 weeks, it's about 42 to 59%. And at 25 weeks, it's 67 to 76%. And that's just survivability, right? That has nothing to do with the actual health of a fetus who is born that early into a pregnancy. And so what are some of the ways, the many, many ways in which viability is garbage as a legal standard? And that's a term that we use in law a lot, just garbage, absolute garbage. One, it's going to vary from fetus to fetus, right? It's going to vary from pregnancy to pregnancy. It's going to vary from pregnant person to pregnant person. So it is not some sort of static line that we can focus on. It also gives the state an unfair, and I would say a far too expansive interest in the bodies and the decisions that are being made of a certain class of people. And that certain class of people, of course, happens to be folks who are capable of pregnancy. It also pushed us and continues to push us to this slide towards personhood and balancing the interests of two persons versus recognizing that there is only one constitutional person during a pregnancy. And in fact, in Roe versus Wade, the court said very explicitly, a fetus is not a constitutional person. It also then forces and asks states to balance a thing that should not, and frankly, really can't be balanced, right? It pretends that we are comparing apples to apples as opposed to comparing apples to oranges. And so where does that leave us? It leaves us very much in the space of having significant concerns about what it looks like to call a fetus a person and what it looks like to balance the rights of the person who is pregnant against a fetus that we have now decided is a person. Now, one thing that I want to say, and I'm so happy to talk about this in Q&A if folks are interested, even if we concede the personhood of a fetus, that tells us nothing about what abortion law should be. And that's a mistake that I think people make a lot, right? And in fact, we have courts that have said, well, of course, if a fetus is a person, then we know that abortion has to be illegal. Absolutely not true, right? And there are all sorts of reasons why that's the case. And again, I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm not going to drill down on that now. Part of what it does, though, this viability line and this sort of pushing us to think of a fetus as a person, is it allows states to criminalize behavior during pregnancy for the benefit of the fetus. So the state has what we call a parens patria power. We are obsessed with using Latin in law for no good reason, really. And parens patria basically means that the state gets to protect those who are not capable of protecting themselves. And that's the reason why we have a child welfare system or a child policing system, depending upon your sense of what our child welfare system does. And so if you have that kind of system, it will always create a target, particularly on certain pregnant people and certain pregnancies. And a really great modern example, very current example of that, of course, is Brady from Ohio, who was sought to be charged, right? The prosecutor sought to charge her because of her miscarriage and sought to charge her with inappropriately disposing of remains. And then they took it to a grand jury, and the grand jury said, we're not going to indict her for that, which in and of itself was sort of amazing, given the way that this country works. But the fact that we have that viability line is exactly what allows those kinds of prosecutions to happen. And certainly there have been successful ones in this country. It also sends lots of messages to other people, and it also gives enormous power to people in healthcare. And the message that it sends to people who are pregnant, who think that they might be miscarrying, is don't go to a hospital. That is not a place where you are safe. Very often when people get reported for pregnancy behavior, those reports are made by healthcare providers. It's a nurse in the hospital, it's a physician in the hospital, maybe it's a social worker in the hospital who says this person has shown up. I don't really know what happens, but it feels like this wasn't just a miscarriage, that this was someone who actually tried to end their pregnancy. And I don't necessarily think it's a good thing when we discourage people from getting healthcare that is needed healthcare. It also sends a message that the person who is pregnant is not just on par with their fetus, but it's actually less than their fetus, right? Because the fetus is someone who is worthy of and in need of care and concern and protection, whereas the pregnant person has now been positioned as somebody who doesn't care at all about that fetus, somebody who is cruel, and in particular, because pregnancies tend to happen in women's bodies, she is a bad mother, right? And there are lots of ways in which we construct who's a bad mother in this country. It also then sends the message that not only are you a failure as a woman for losing a pregnancy, which is very much the way, unfortunately, miscarriage can often be construed in this country, but you are in fact a criminal. You are somebody who is engaged in an intentional act of wrongdoing. It also sends the message that your worth lies in your ability to successfully bear children, which no one should ever think is true. There are way too many babies in this world already. And that your obligation, if you do become pregnant, is to produce a good pregnancy outcome, ignoring the fact that there are all sorts of reasons, many of them that are structural in this country, why some folks don't have quote unquote good pregnancy outcomes. And then finally, there's a way of really instantiating this idea, as I said, that there are people who are bad mothers and there are people who are good mothers, and bad mothers are the ones who don't carry pregnancies to term or who don't want to stay pregnant, no matter how it is that they came to be pregnant in the first instance. So just to sort of wrap this up here, there's really no value neutral way to regulate abortion based on viability. Once you decide that that is a line, that is a deeply meaningful line, you have made a values judgment, a moral judgment, an ethical judgment, and a legal judgment. You can't protect a fetus without elevating it to the same status, if not a higher status, than a pregnant person. And conceding otherwise undermines the constitutional personhood of women and other people who are pregnant. That is just a fact. You cannot do that and not at the same time be undermining the personhood of others, and particularly those folks who are most vulnerable. So we're talking about young women, women of color, women who are poor, women who are undocumented, the people who are least able to protect themselves against state power. And so when we compromise on this issue, when we say, all right, well, of course there has to be abortion regulation, and the only reasonable place to regulate abortion is at the point viability, what we are really doing is compromising the humanity of pregnant people, and particularly of pregnant women, especially the most vulnerable women who we are trying to protect. And I'll stop there.
So I'm going to do this for a second. I'm going to confess that while Professor Mutcherson was talking, I was sitting here madly taking notes and being like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. I need to include this in the next thing that I write. So you may be getting some emails being like, that thing you said, how do you want me to cite that? Because it clarified several things. So I'm going to confess even more transparently that there may be a chunk in the middle where this thing that I've written, I usually don't write when I talk lately, but this thing that I've written may get a little bit messy because I really tried to shove in while you were talking this brilliant thought that changed how I thought about something I thought I was going to say. So we'll see how that goes. And if it doesn't make sense, you can ask me about it later. So I want to start off by saying that I'm not going to talk about Black reproductivity as specifically as I normally do today. But anyone who knows me knows that if you scratch the surface, I'm always ready to talk about Blackness and reproduction. So I encourage some question asking, but I'm going to talk about it some. So if you have been following the coverage since the day of the Dobbs decision a year and a half ago, all the way through the anniversary of Roe earlier this year, you've seen a kind of common set of stories. How in the Midwestern states from Missouri to Wisconsin, patients with ruptured fallopian tubes, uterine infections, or life-threatening placental hemorrhages were experiencing unheard of delays in treatment, while hospital administrators parsed unclear legal codes to determine questions of criminal and civil liability. Across Texas, expectant parents are mourning non-viable pregnancies and risking sepsis while navigating the obstacles that the state's so-called heartbeat law have placed in the way of medical terminations after 6 weeks of gestation. And in Ohio, and this was really kind of a key case, the first key case from Ohio, a pregnant 10-year-old survivor of sexualized and gendered violence was required to travel to Indiana to escape her home state's abortion ban with no exceptions for rape or incest. So what we see in all of these stories are two sympathetic subjects who come into being, these two protagonists of the post-Dobbs moment. These innocent victims who deserved abortions and couldn't get access to them, and these desperate doctors risking their licenses and livelihoods to provide much-needed healthcare services. And I want to say for a moment that I recognize that the stories that I am talking about are horrific. They have kept me up at night when I'm doom scrolling. They are profoundly examples of a level of state violence and the willingness to engage in a calculus about whose life matters that we should all be appalled by. But I want to put them in a broader context to explain why I'm so troubled by the kind of ubiquitous role that they have played in the kind of popular mainstream discourse post-Dobbs. And I want to do that by juxtaposing them with a second discourse. A discourse that we saw where this unprecedented constraint on reproductive freedom that Dobbs was described by in popular media and by political leaders marked a crisis for the triumph of liberal governance in relation to reproductive, and by extension, women's, and I'm using women's there very intentionally, women's rights. In this narrative, we saw elected officials from the President of the United States to city council members all decried Dobbs as a tragic step backwards for equal rights that foreshadowed a national reversion to pre-Roe back alleys. Even as Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, and even the Young Democrats of America warned that it was the first step in a forward march toward a post-Dobbs dystopian future in which reproductive rights are under attack like never before. I want you to really sit with that for a minute. Reproductive rights are under attack like never before. So within this narrative, Dobbs was depicted as a wormhole in the linear progression of liberal governance through which the United States would be simultaneously dragged back to an earlier, less enlightened area and propelled forward into a draconian dystopian future. And I am not underplaying the fact that Dobbs is a catastrophe, and it is a drastic change. Instead, what I'm trying to point to are how these iterative depictions of escalating medical and legal crises erase how, as Kim points out, these crises in reproductive freedom and actual equal access and autonomy in making reproductive choices around abortion already existed. This is not a new crisis. What has changed is scope and scale. And this pre-existing crisis is what I call reproductive carcerality. And I'm going to come back to that notion of reproductive carcerality in a moment, but I want to really kind of parse these two discourses first. The thing about these two related discourses is that both of which suggest that everything could be solved by the return of Roe. In so doing, they both conceal and rely on existing relations of race, classed, and sexualized power and difference. So let's talk about what they conceal first. The protagonists in all of these tales of Dobbsian catastrophe and the redemption of Roe's return are represented as iconic reproductive subjects, empathetic representatives of universal womanhood in crisis, a category that feminists of color have long argued is implicitly synonymous with whiteness. At the same time, the oft-repeated assertion that these incidents of legal overstep and medical impotence constitute a level of reproductive coercion like never before serve to erase the long and well-documented history of forced reproduction, coercive sterilization, blocked access to abortion, and all of the other forms of medical and state surveillance and criminalization that have shaped the reproductive experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other reproducing people of color for centuries, literally centuries. So going from what's concealed to what is relied on. With their emphasis on medical emergencies, non-viable pregnancies, and desperate doctors caught up as collateral damage in Dobbs' aftermath, these stories collectively make this implicit distinction between the unwitting, largely straight, white, and middle-class victims of reproductive abandonment depicted in these stories of medical and legal extremity, and those ostensibly less innocent pregnant people who simply seek to terminate their pregnancy in the interests of their own quotidian well-being. In the words of one desperate victim of Texas's 6-week abortion ban, you know, they paint this woman into being this individual that doesn't care about her life, doesn't care about the life of the children she creates or whatever. And she just recklessly and negligently goes out and gets abortions all willy-nilly left and right. You know, abortions are sometimes needed out of an act of emergency, out of an act of saving a woman's life. This is not the only example. I watched recently the On the Brink series that ABC did, you know, in this moment where they're looking at all these women and what they say is what you have to understand is these were wanted pregnancies. It's all about people who had to have abortions and couldn't get access after. Yeah. So Roe, it is suggested, is a magic bullet, the law that enabled deserving women to get abortions while putting in place limits for those people who were taking advantage of the system. So Who are these abortion seekers who are deemed guilty of irrationality, recklessness, and negligence, for whom the position of the empathetic victim is foreclosed? Well, the statistics that Dr. Weitz talked about earlier would suggest that they are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, likely to be living at or below 200% of the poverty line. These are the folks who, by the way, were being investigated and criminalized for incidents of fetal non-viability long before Dobbs, through drug cases, fetal endangerment cases, all different kinds of laws, who have struggled to gain access to affordable, accessible abortions for years under Roe because of waiting periods, viability laws, and of course, the Hyde Amendment. So this question of putting in place limits between the deserving and those who are taking advantage of the system, and I want to flag that for a moment because anyone who was around in the 80s and 90s knows that when we talk about who's taking advantage of the system versus deserving women, the image of the Black welfare queen should be just flashing across your head right now. So, this line between the deserving and those who are taking advantage of the system is the same line that Professor Mutcherson was talking about as the viability line. It is the same line that scholars of race would talk about as the line between whose lives matter and whose lives don't. If Roe is this magic bullet, it does so not by creating a system in which people have access to or return to reproductive freedom. Rather, it's because they are returning to an earlier model of reproductive carcerality. So when I talk about reproductive carcerality here, I'm going to take a side note from this for a minute to say that one of the things that I'm not talking about here, but I would really like to talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested, is the fact that when we think about these lines of things like viability in particular, and this was the part I was trying to squish in because of what you said that was so brilliant, is that this notion of viability as a scientific measure is built on this kind of idealization of reproductive science as a site of knowledge production and of kind of equal neutral knowledge. And for anyone who has studied Black reproduction, what you know is that the history of reproductive science is completely inextricable from the history of chattel slavery. That in fact, the development of reproductive medicine is completely concomitant, completely simultaneous with the end of the transatlantic slave trade, and the need to produce a system of so-called natural increase, in which the US functioned as the only slave society in the Americas that increased its enslaved labor population through biological reproduction and trade. This required both a social and biological management and study, surveillance, constraint, experimentation on the bodies of enslaved Black women with the interest of increasing their reproductive viability. Some of this was in forms of rations, some of this was in forms of what kinds of work they did, what kinds of clothes they wore. Some of this was in the form of replacing midwifery with medicalized care, and a great deal of this was literally physical surgical experimentation on enslaved Black people's bodies in order to try to retain their reproductive viability longer. So the father of gynecological medicine in the United States, J. Marion Sims, was a white man who purchased enslaved people from slaveholders who found them to be no longer reproductively viable because they were put in situations where they reproduced so frequently that they had a biological condition that made it impossible for them to engage in basic comfortable living, but also made it impossible for them to reproduce. And the experimentation on them produced the scientific technologies and advancements that were considered the birth of modern gynecology. So when I say that the notion that this neutral scientific knowledge production around reproduction and viability has never been a neutral site for Black bodies, I mean very clearly that this line has always been a line that measures whose life matters and whose life doesn't. So that said, I want to turn to reproductive carcerality for 1 minute and then 1 minute to talk about abolition. So when we talk about reproductive carcerality, we are talking about an ideology and a mode of governmentality. And I want to talk mostly about the mode of governmentality here. If the ideology is that punishment-oriented responses are understood to be natural, appropriate, and effective ways to manage a society, than as a mode of governmentality, a system of state management. It's one in which the technologies of the prison or the jail, that is surveillance, containment, isolation, punishment, and invasion of your life by state control at every intimate scale, comes to characterize all aspects of life. Not just legal aspects, but social aspects, educational aspects, medical aspects. When we talk about reproductive carcerality, we're not just talking about what Michelle Goodwin describes as the fact that statistically during Roe, being pregnant made people in the US increasingly vulnerable to entanglement within carceral systems, but also that the very concept of reproduction has functioned as sufficient to justify all systems of discipline and punishment. And this is the logic that underlies that line in Roe, right? That there is a state compelling interest in deciding when an abortion is acceptable and when it is unacceptable, when it is legal and when it is illegal. So if the restriction of abortion at any point, including at the point of viability, already functions as a system of malign abandonment, disproportionately impacting people of color in regions where people of color and poor white people are more likely to have restricted access to affordable contraceptives, lack of resource to travel, these are things we've already talked about, I'm going to go down, then returning to Roe reinstantiates these existing structures of reproductive carcerality by justifying and naturalizing state capacities to surveil and control and punish the bodies and lives of reproductive subjects of color. So, what does it mean to abolish abortion laws? One, it means that we're actually making a case for reproductive autonomy, recognizing that reproductive health has always been a mode of surveillance, control, coercion, and extraction for Black and other people of color, and arguing instead for a politics of autonomy and freedom. It's not simply making a case for better well-being and better life outcomes when people have access to abortions that they have control over deciding, but also that abortion restrictions are ways of disciplining non-heteropatriarchal sexual behaviors, that they're on a continuum with other systems of reproductive carcerality like drug laws and other forms, and that we are drawing lines through these kinds of restrictions between those whose bodies need to be policed and those who don't, and that those lines are always raced and sexualized and usually classed. But beyond that, I want to turn to what abolition means, which is not simply getting rid of something like laws. This is my last paragraph, I promise, Tracy. Abolition doesn't just mean the absence of what we don't want, but as renowned abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, it is about the presence of what we do want. Gilmore talks about what we want in abolition as those vital systems of support that many communities lack, the structures and practices that resolve inequalities and provide people the resources to live in the generative ways that we collectively desire. In the case of reproductive abolition, the goal is not simply the abolition of abortion laws, but the question of what we seek to be present in their place. It is about making a call not for restriction, carcerality, surveillance, and constraint, but for creating the actual conditions of reproductive justice. Childcare, social support, educational systems, non-policing, systems that reduce gendered violence. We cannot talk about reproductive justice at this point in time without talking about reproductive abolition. Because even as we seek to produce those things I just listed, which are the kind of key issues of reproductive justice, the idea that not only can everybody choose to have a baby or not have a baby, but that they can have the conditions in place that enable them to make that choice freely. But we cannot actually have justice if we don't also produce the conditions of actual freedom. And I'll end there.
Hi, friends. Okay, that's terrible. Hi, friends. Hi. God. All right. I'm sure you've all heard Restore Roe all week. President had a whole rally, big old sign said Restore Roe, defend choice. How many of you would be okay with fully legalizing abortion again, but you do have to trade in that if somebody wants an abortion in the second trimester and they get to the clinic too late, they can't actually have it. But you do get legal abortion for everybody else. Okay, I'll give you legal abortion, but only doctors can perform it, and they actually get to make the final decision on it. Any takers? Okay. You can have legal abortion, but in order to get it, it is up to those same doctors, I know, and yes, they are nearly 70% white, and the people who need the abortions are 2/3 Black and brown, but Nikki Haley said racism doesn't exist. So that would be okay, right? You guys would go for that? Okay, I'll give you legal abortion, but you have to pay for it on your own bootstraps. I know you only have $10, but like, make it work. Girl boss. You going for it? So riddle me this, Batman. Why the fuck are we restoring Roe? I don't know. It's the question I've been asked all week by reporters, because there's only a few of us who are willing to talk shit about the president publicly. Here's the thing. When he says restore Roe, do you know what that means? What does it mean? Have you seen his plan? Have you seen his plan? Do you know what it means when Biden says restore Roe? Do you know what that means?
Just bring it back to the way it was.
Yeah. With what policy? Do you know which parts? Anybody else? I haven't seen a plan. So what are we restoring? We're restoring all of those exceptions. That, where we left people out. That. I don't know, man. I don't know. Abortion anytime, any reason. It's a pretty radical ask. Is it? Is it? You guys have the little purple pieces of paper in front of you. Came in, right? And they'll say abortion or abolish all abortion laws. That picture is 50 years old. If we went out and said that right now, that's considered radical, but that's a 50-year-old ask. What are we asking for right now? They just told you the problems with what we're asking for. So what are we doing? Where's our imagination? I'm bored. To quote Beyonce, all this shit out here is boring. Hello. It is. How is Restore Roe a rallying call? You just heard how useless it was. And yes, let me be clear. I got my abortion because Roe existed, but also because I had one credit card with a $500 max that I was able to like pay for the whole thing. And I happened to have a clinic in my community. That is rare now. And that was before all of the restrictions that were allowed under Roe were allowed to exist. We have traded in our liberatory vision for a seat at the table. For what? For what? To defend Roe? Okay. It took that man 2 years to say the word abortion. I know, because I had an entire website, didbidensayAbortionYet.org, and I tracked it. And I bugged him enough to get him to say the word abortion. You're welcome. Why, if he wants to restore it, is it so difficult for him to talk about it? But this isn't actually just about him. I really do like that, like ragging on him. He's very annoying. But it's not just about him, because that's the larger problem. with the inability to imagine and to think about liberation and what does it mean to think beyond Roe, to think beyond the bare minimum. I believe you deserve more than the bare minimum. Call me radical, but I do. I believe that you deserve a safe, legal is a complicated word, but free abortion. Virginia, if you think that's a new phrase that you haven't heard. That one's 50 years old too. You know what we traded it in for? Say it.
Safe, legal, and rare.
I won't even say it because I hate that phrase so much. I'll vomit up here. It killed our imagination. For my book, Liberating Abortion, Our Legacy, Stories, and Vision for How We Save Us, it'll be in your classrooms, October 2024. I talked to some of the Janes. How many of you knew that there were Black Janes? Well, you do. Can I as a storyteller? I've interviewed both of them. Like the white Janes came to this work because they cared about reproduction and our communities and people's ability to have families. They came to it from a socialist lens. They came to it from an anti-war lens. They were actually they met because they were organizing against the Vietnam War and for civil rights. But they forget to tell you that part of the story. Feels relevant now, huh? Because we know that reproductive justice goes hand in hand with liberation and anti-imperialism. We know that it goes hand in hand with economic justice and socialism. We know this. We've known this since 1920s. Russians legalized abortion at that point because it was part of their socialist agenda. It's not new. None of it's new. But we've killed our imagination when we tell these stories. We tell the story of the wins of how we got here, but we forget to tell the story of the people that we left behind. Whether that's the radical thinkers or the people we actually hurt along the way. How many of you have heard the story of Rosie Jimenez? Couple folks? Okay. The way our movement tells it, Rosie Jimenez was the first victim of the Hyde Amendment. She wanted an abortion, but the Hyde Amendment, which is the federal ban on Medicaid coverage, she could not use her Medicaid to pay for an abortion. So she went to an illegal provider. I shouldn't even say illegal, an unsafe provider. And she hemorrhaged a couple of days later and she died on October 3rd, 1977. The way our movement tells it is in this white savior way. She was hurt by the Hyde Amendment. But we forget to mention that Rosie had actually had 2 abortions before that one. She had one January, just before the other one that she had in October. Those were covered by Medicaid. She went to that same clinic and they turned her away because she did not have the money. And so she went to an unsafe provider that everyone in the community knew was shit. That's why she died. Yes, it was the Hyde Amendment, but we have to be honest. That is because we put money over her care. You'll hear from the DC Abortion Fund about how often that happens. That's bullshit. That should not be a radical thing to say. And yet, I'm sure saying, look, I want free abortions. That's radical. Because Rosie would be here if we had free abortions. But what does the abolition of abortion mean? They've talked a lot about, policing and all of those things, right? But I want to actually give you some examples. I'm gonna talk shit about Biden again for a second. So my organization, we launched a campaign during his 2022 State of the Union trying to get him to say the word abortion. We sent newspapers to his house. I don't know if he got them. Probably his staffers like threw our little, they were like wrappers on the front of them. It was great. There were calls to get him to say the word abortion. He said the word abortion 0 times. Do you know what he said 3 times? Fund the police. Fund the police. Fund the police. People tell you who they are. How can you say that you want to restore Roe and you think it's horrible that people are being criminalized for their abortions, but then you turn around and gave all of the states the money to get us arrested? Restore Roe, I don't believe you. What does that look like? Does that look like you taking that money back from the police? Taking them billions back to fund an abortion fund? That's what it looks like for me. I shouldn't be radical because I want healthcare fully funded. Every time I see a police officer walking down the street, I'm like, God damn, you could be at school. You've been in New York City, you see like the piles of police officers. I'm like, God damn, that's a health center. But I want to be clear, the key to liberating abortion is not only eradicating the very real police criminalization of abortion, but the police that are in our heads. The police in our heads who are governed by racism and anti-Blackness. That's what she was talking about who you feel sorry for when they need an abortion versus who you judge. If I stand up here and tell you that I had 6 abortions versus if I tell you I had 1. If I tell you I had 1 at 34 weeks versus if I tell you I had 1 at 6 weeks. At what point do you feel sorry for me? Do you feel more sorry for me because I'm light skinned? Do you feel more sorry for me because I'm skinny? Because I'm well poised? That's the police in our heads. That's the anti-Blackness that we're taught that keeps us from actually achieving liberation and thinking differently about what could be achieved. Because here's the thing. I get a lot of flack from like socialist bros who are like, yeah, but like if we have socialism, we won't it won't be a problem. And I'm like, but racism still exists. I love me some Scandinavia. I love me some Sweden. And the backlash that they're having to their socialist policies is because it's anti-immigrant and anti-Black sentiment, because a lot of their immigrants are coming from Central and North Africa. We actually have to do the work to eradicate the anti-Black policing that is in our heads. And it is at the core of all of the work that keeps us from caring about everyone who needs and has abortions. I believe that we are the key to liberating abortion, but we actually have to imagine something different. For me, that's abortion anytime, any reason. Great slogan, get into it. Fits nicely on a sign. Abortion anytime, any reason, anywhere. But think about what that means for you. How can we meaningfully restore Roe or defend choice with the current policing system that we have, with the president and governors and even our favorite congresswomen, congressmen handing billions to police? It's not possible. Liberating abortion is not solely the absence of restrictions and stigma. It is the actual presence of support and love and resources. It is fully funded clinics in our community, fully funded access to pills in our community. You being able to have an abortion, if you want it at a clinic, if you want it at home, you want it at a hotel, hell, you want a green eggs and ham? I don't really care. Your body, your choice, whatever. But that you have it and you get to set up a situation that is the best for you with whoever you want or with no one, because you know what's best for you. And let me tell you, you cannot OD on abortion pills. Your stomach's going to hurt. a lot from the MISO, but you can't OD on them. They're really safe. For me, liberating abortion is everyone knowing that there's a place that for them and that they get support and that they get loved on. It's knowing that the person I drove to a clinic this morning for her 34-week abortion knows that she can call me at any point for whatever she needs. It's simply knowing that somebody is there for you, whether it's to give you the money and the resources or a ride or whatever. It is abolishing all abortion laws. But first, all of us who consider ourselves pro-choice actually have to do the work to acknowledge the anti-Blackness and the police that are in our heads that are keeping us from imagining something beautiful, something new, something different that actually this time includes people who have abortions in the text of whatever it is. Because I swear if we get left out one more time, I'm going to scream. We deserve to be at the center of our own story and the center of our own movement. We know what's best for us. And by listening to us, that is how we will liberate abortion. Thank you.
Fabulous speakers, right? Let's give them one more round of applauding. So it's my job to moderate, but I wanted to take a whole different prerogative with tonight and was really to allow the speakers to ask questions of each other. So we'll spend a few minutes where you can ask the follow-up questions that you really wanted when each of you was speaking. And then I think we will have a chance to take some questions from the audience and potentially some from the online. But I'd want to start by, you each talked about, sort of what comes into focus when we change from Roe to an abolitionist framework. And I would hope maybe you could ask each other, what's the next question after that?
Okay, I guess I have two questions. So, I guess the first question is, okay, I'm going to go one way and not both ways because that doesn't work. So, Renee, I want to know from you, what do you think are the mechanisms? Because I think about this a lot. Like, what are the mechanisms for doing that decolonizing work, right? That internal abolition work? Because I think it is, I've been working in prison abolition for 20 years and I feel like it is so much work to get people past, even to get myself, right? It always crops back up that past the what about, okay, but what about this case? But what about that case? So what do you think? Because you have so much experience doing this kind of organizing, what do you think that step of getting folks to do that work looks like?
I think one of the things that when I finally felt super free in my abortion opinions, I guess. When I say abortion anytime, any reason, yes, I mean it. And yes, before you ask me, well, what about, yes. Yes. I don't care what your little example is. Because at what point, what you are trying to do is find someone to exclude. And I think as a society, we are socialized to group with like-minded people. And in order to make groupings with like-minded people, which can be great. I love being in all Black space, right? But also then that can create this idea of who do we exclude and how do we exclude? And it's based on what our perceived values and judgments are. And so I think you have to, I love when people are like, say to me, they're like, oh, I'm as pro-choice as it gets when they're about to like challenge me on something. I'm like, I promise you, you're not. Because if you have to say that, then you're not. You're just not. And so I think The first step is recognizing is that you're not as pro-choice as you think you are. I don't have them on me today, but I often have my abortion pills on me. It makes people really uncomfortable when I pull them out. Ask yourself why that is. They're just pills. I also got Tylenol over there too. That's more dangerous. But ask yourself why those pills scare you. So you actually have to do the work. Just like undoing anti-Blackness, you can't just like throw up a black square and be like, oh, I really care. Okay. How are you actually actively participating in anti-Blackness? And I don't mean like the words that you use and things like that, but it's actually the absence of inclusion or recognition of how anti-Blackness shows up in your world and in your life. And so I think it's that same thing around abortion stigma, thinking about what is the absence of it. And so when you actually like humble yourself enough to like do that thinking and do that work and be like, I don't know, that is huge. I will also say, read a book. I know it sounds like, I don't mean to sound condescending, but it's true. Some of the most radical ideas that I've seen on abortion, our movement actually already had. Like, I'm telling you, this is a 50-year-old photo. Abolish all abortion laws now. No organization would put that on a banner at a march. We can't even put the word abortion on a banner at a march. So, like, actually study where we've been. We tell the story of Jane, but we don't talk about how Jane, I mean, they were both happy that Roe v. Wade, the decision came down. They were also really disappointed because they never believed that the right and the decision should go to the doctors. They wanted to set up community clinics because guess what? They did 11,000 abortions and never lost anyone. So when we tell the story of pre-Roe, we tell the story of all the like back alley unsafe abortions, and then we tell the story of Jane, but we forget that those actually coexisted at the same time. So we actually have to challenge the stories that we're told, the things that we've learned, the lies that we're told. I mean, so much about abortion is just absolute fucking lie. If you want to learn more, you can listen to my podcast because we go through them all. The A files. But yeah, I think you really, really do have to. I know it like gets thrown around of like, you know, decolonize your mind, but like, no, like literally do the work and actually be like, what is this? Why am I uncomfortable with it? And like, think it through. And how do I get to a place that like, actually, I don't care. I used to be uncomfortable with the idea of like herbal abortions because I was like, they're not effective. And that technically, in some of them, yes, they are technically less effective than like a pill, right? But also, like everything fails. And why do we judge, in particular, a method that our ancestors had used for a long time and Indigenous folks had used for a long time and was a precursor? It might not be the choice that people choose now, a method they choose a lot now, but also you can still respect that someone wants to use that method. And that also, if it doesn't work, they can have a backup method and a backup method and a backup method. Because guess what? The pills don't work either sometimes. And so people have to go and then they have a backup method in clinic. So anyway, I just challenge yourself. That's all. Can I ask you a question?
Ask me.
I think one of the really big challenges that we often have in movements now is that we almost treat them like they are advertising campaigns, right? And so one of the things that there's this sort of constant pushback on is don't use the language of abolition because it makes people uncomfortable and they don't know what to do with it. And we can't abolish things, which is just ludicrous, right? And then particularly when you think in it with a historical lens, abolition was a really important concept, right? For say people like me, right? Who like to be free, abolition really mattered. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the importance of using language that even sometimes makes people uncomfortable in order to get them to a certain place.
Yeah, I love that because I love that because I think it really pushes off of, I think, the way that you were talking about putting the pills out there and making people uncomfortable. I think, I stick with the word abolition for many reasons. One, because I think it's so interesting that when we talk about, the abolitionists and we're talking about slavery, everyone is like, oh, but they were good, like they were good white people who were abolishing slavery, right? But when we talk about prison abolitionists, they're unrealistic people who think that we can change something that could never be changed. And I'm like, you do realize that if you read the old newspapers, which I've spent a lot of time doing, do you know how they talked about the slavery abolitionists as crazy, radical, idealistic, unrealistic people who are trying to abolish something that if you ended it would literally destroy the entire nation and it could never happen. And yet now we're like, oh, but that made so much sense. And so I think that it matters. I think in the very ways that Renee was saying, it matters to use this language because this is the only way we push people to say that's impossible so that you can then say, why? Why is this impossible? And how did you come to believe that this was impossible? Right? In the same way that when you talk about, abortions, any reason, anytime, any place, and people will always say in the same way when you talk about prison abolition, any abolitionist cause, the first thing that people say is there has to be a limit somewhere. I agree, but there has to be a limit somewhere. In prison abolition, it's what about the rapists and the murderers? In abortion abolition, it's like, what about partial birth abortion was the big one for years and years and years and years. Remember partial birth abortion? Right? Like,
How could we forget?
right? The pictures, right? In any issue you talk about, or you talk about debt abolition, and they're like, well, what about the people who purposely get like 1 million degrees and like they rack up all that debt and they're never planning on paying it back? Right? There's always a what about, right? The people who are on the wrong side of the line, who what we're really saying whenever we say the what about, what we're saying is, but what about those people who deserve to be policed, who deserve to be surveilled and controlled and punished, who we aren't? And so whenever people say, what about, that's impossible because what about, I think the question we ask ourselves is, why are we so convinced? I mean, aside from like the broader ideological, like altruistic idea of why do we think it's okay to punish other people or to police other people or whatever. But dude, I've been doing Black studies for a long time and I realize that it is actually integral to racial capitalism and the structure of the US and most of the world that somebody has to be the people who are less than human who we police. And it's kind of usually Black people. But that said, right, it's nice other people as well. You don't have to be Black to fall into that category, though, right. So that said, I think the much more pragmatic question is, do you recognize that what about line is always moving? And what makes you so confident that you have the capacity to always stay on the safe and free side of that line? I mean, I can tell you, like, when I got my abortion, I was, a classic angel case, right? Like barely viable pregnancy, blah, 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 wanted pregnancy. I wanted it, I cried, I couldn't go back and forth, I blah, blah, blah. And I still had to travel across county lines and go to my abortion provider's second-rate clinic because she was like, I don't let patients like you come through the door at my fancy clinic. You have to go to the other clinic that's in South Central LA where like people like you, AKA people who have abortions, go. So the reality is it is a flexible line, right? You are never, ever, when you buy into a system that accepts that some people's freedom comes at the cost of other people's unfreedom, you are buying into a losing proposition, not just for them, but for you. And that's why it's important to use phrases like abolition.
Okay, I have a question. Because this is the one I get all the time, and I'm like, ugh, I didn't go to law school. I don't care. It's not my job. My job is to come up with all the fun ideas. So we do have to have some law to legalize abortion, of course.
No, we don't.
So what does that look like?
But we don't.
But we do. I'm always like, let's talk about decriminalization. But that's the question I get all the time, right? Of like, okay, fine. Yeah, Roe sucks. Fine. But like, you know, we are a nation of laws. We do have to have a law that says that abortion is legal, right? That is absolutely not true. It's just not true, right? I mean, just think about all the things we do in a day where there's no law that says you get to do that, right? Like I went to a store today and I bought candy. There's no law that says you get to go to a store and buy candy, right? Imagine what the world would look like if we had a law for every single thing that we get to do. It wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. So we don't need a law unless what we want to do is limit. Right? That's what we most often use law for. We use law to constrain, we use it to limit, we use it to find justification for particular things. So we could have a world in which certainly there was no statutory law, right? There's no, now I have to go to law school, right? Get nerdy, let's do it. So there's no actual, law that's passed by Congress or a law that's passed by a state legislature, right? You could have case law, which is a judge says, okay, I have a case that comes before me and I make this decision and now I've created case law, but there's not any particular statute. All of that could happen, certainly, but it's absolutely not the case that we need law to tell us what we can do, or that we need law to tell us what is right, or that we need law to tell us what is moral or ethical, right? So the argument I would, if I were going to make an argument about the need for law, I would say that the need for law would be to keep people from interfering with what you should be able to do in the first place, right?
So then what's the solution, and how do we get to like a decriminalization of abortion where people aren't subject to criminalization in states where it has been banned?
I mean, in an ideal world, you have a Supreme Court that is made of Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, Justice Jackson, and nobody else.
Good luck.
Right?
I saw that in Barbie. It looked interesting.
that might get us someplace, right? But without that, I mean, what we would actually need is people who say all of this regulating that is going on, that is about limitation, is the exactly wrong direction to be going in, right? I mean, even if you want to say anything nice about Roe, potentially what you could say is, sure, there's a reason to have, for instance, standard medical standards, right? Of like, that you should probably have some concept of what you're doing, right? Or that you should, engage in, safe practices, right? But even that then is going to get you into the space of, that's why only doctors should perform abortions, or that's why, advanced practice nurses can't perform abortions, or so, there's no standard that says we can only do things because we have a law that says that we can. It's just that simple.
Okay, that set up a lot. I think I'm supposed to. We have a few minutes for questions. So if you are in the room and you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We'll have a mic brought over to you.
She's coming.
Oh. Mr. Wong is the mic person at every event.
I love it. Simple. Okay, hi. First, I want to say your speeches and everything were amazing. I love hearing you guys talk and learning cool things. But my question has to do with I don't know if you guys have noticed everything that's unfolding in Palestine and Gaza right now, where we're seeing reports of pregnant women being bulldozed and women not having access to feminine hygiene products, or not having access to abortion or reproductive care. So my question would be how do you connect this idea of reproductive carcerality and the issue of reproductive justice and or abortion to the situation of genocide unfolding right now?
Okay, I'm going to start here because I've been thinking about this constantly, and this is first a shout out to my students in what class was it? I don't know what it was called. Lit 370, AFAM 350, maybe last semester, Race and Reproduction, who gave this unbelievable presentation in talking about reproductive politics in the context of Gaza and Israel's genocide in Gaza right now. So, what I think we need to understand is that this is where the context of reproductive justice becomes absolutely crucial, and understanding that it's not simply what we are seeing. And so the way that reproductive rights have been constructed in the US in the last really 50 years, and not before then, and not without a huge amount of pushback even during then, is that reproductive rights in the US are about abortion rights. When in reality, right, that has never been the center of thinking about reproductive justice in the United States. And, you know, if we were to take my race and reproduction class, or really probably anything any of us teach, it would talk about how abortion is really a very minor aspect of when we think about what it means to be able to have a child if you choose to have a child, and not have a child if you choose not to have a child. How this requires all kinds of infrastructure, right? It requires access to medical care. It requires shelter. It requires social services. It requires education. It requires childcare. All those things I was talking about. You know, anything you read by Loretta Ross, who talks about the reproductive justice framework, Sister Song Collective will talk about it. Many groups will talk about it. So when we think about Gaza, one of the first things we think about is how reproductive justice has long been entirely impossible in the context of Gaza, precisely because Gaza has been an open-air prison for 17 years and was already a site that was operating under Zionist apartheid long before that. So what we know is that in that context, reproductive freedom and reproductive justice were already impossible. We know that pregnant people in Gaza had, if they needed to go into labor and they had a pregnancy complication, that there was that the lack of medical resources and the curtailment of Gaza meant that if you had a really intense pregnancy complication and you couldn't deliver safely in Gaza, you would need to go to a hospital in Israel. If you needed to go to a hospital in Israel, ambulances from Gaza are not allowed to cross the checkpoint. So you would get driven in an ambulance to the checkpoint, and then you would wait for an Israeli ambulance to come and pick you up, however long it took, to then take you to a hospital in Israel. The rates of maternal infant mortality are massively high. The rates of bad outcomes are massively high. The rates of, early birth, early pregnancy, delivery, and bad outcomes, incredibly high. We also have to pair this with two other issues, that in a context of ongoing population control, what this meant is that within Gaza, there's a huge pronatalist sentiment that really actually functions to operate as a form of nationalist pressure that often can reduce Palestinian women to a kind of wombs for the nation. This is not unique to Gaza. This is not a Muslim thing. This is Panthers. This is Black nationalism. This is the Brown Berets. Right? This is like a history, right? This idea that the way that we support nations that are under siege to racial colonial oppression is by, valorizing reproduction at the cost of women's well-being. And what we also have to recognize that is Israel as a state has a deep pronatalist project that has incentivized the reproduction of Ashkenazi middle-class Jews and disincentivize the reproduction of other, not just non-citizens of the Israeli state, but citizens of the state. So when we talk about Gaza and Israel, what we are talking about is a system that, much like the US, and I want to be very clear, I am not exceptionalizing Israel in this. I am saying that it is an extreme scope and scale of what we understand to happen in the US, where there are racial and nationalist logics around who should reproduce, who can safely reproduce, whose reproductive lives are valued, who is supposed to make babies, and who is not.
And who gets to raise their children
And
in
who
safe
then
places.
gets to raise their children safely once they are born.
I was going to say, okay.
Sorry, just so we can have a few extra questions. Is there, you want to pass the mic? Oh, did it go back out? Oh, yeah. Right here, in the front row.
Thank you. I'll preface this by saying my home state is Ohio, so sorry for being worse.
Texas is
Not you.
Yeah, that's true.
You're gerrymandering shitty politicians.
What are you gonna do? I feel like my question is kind of maybe downwind from the previous one. I was particularly struck by your mentioning of the Russian Revolution and their, legalization, if you will, of abortion. And I'm partial to the former East Germany for the same reasons. Do you foresee or hope for more sort of internationalism around this issue? And I mean, anyone here can answer, but that and I've seen recently that there's a abortion collective in Mexico, I think, that like American abortion collectives now are kind of pulling from. Do you see that increasing, or does it feel more isolating in this moment?
Yeah, I actually last month went to the country of Andorra. Does anyone know where that is? Okay, great. You do. Great. I didn't until shortly before I went. It's a small, tiny little country between France and Spain. And it's this little country where a woman there, it's the only country in the EU where abortion is completely banned. And so an activist there spoke before the UN talking about the impact of the abortion ban. And the nation, the government of Andorra, prosecuted her for ruining their prestige because she was talking shit about them at the UN. And her lawyer was like, she just spit facts. What are you mad about? Right. And the reason I'm telling you this is because, so my colleague and I, we went, and there were activists from the UK, all over Europe. A bunch came from Spain, all over different places. And the one thing they kept saying to us was, what are you guys doing here? The US never comes to anything. You guys came here to this? Oh. We have been absolutely awful at showing up globally. One of the things that I think is the biggest challenge for US activists is the amount of navel gazing that we do to just look at, well, if we haven't come up with a solution, it must not be a solution. Because we don't look at history of what the folks organizing before us did, and we don't look globally to see what folks are doing. There's obviously Marea Verde, which is the green wave, is happening all throughout Latin America. There's a lot of solidarity work that's happening with them. I have been able to learn so much from Latin American activists. And I think personally, I have become such a better activist in the last 4 or 5 years in doing global work, learning from other people. Do you know you could do medication abortion with pills way into the second trimester? Learn that from global activists. Learn security from global activists. And so I think that the more US activists and all of us actually look beyond our own borders for ideas, but also what our policies are doing to other people, where our tax dollars are going, global gag rules, all of that stuff, we will actually become more informed citizens of the world, and we will become better abortion activists. That's part of what I was talking about, that imagination. Because the FDA tells you that you can't use abortion pills up until about 10 weeks. But if you go outside of the borders, you'll learn so much more. So I really hope that you'll study other movements and just even follow some of the other activists on social, even if their stuff is in other languages, just hit that C translation button and read and learn. It's great.
Well, I feel like that's the right note for us to end on tonight, is that encouragement to always be learning from outside our own scope. I want to offer the panelists, if there's one last thought that's been burning in your brain, you can say it here, or we can move to reception and people might be able to ask you questions then.
Well, I'm not going to stay for the reception because I actually have to go catch a train now to New York. This has been a very rough day for me. But one thing that I will say is that part of the problem is that we are not a human rights regime. We're a constitutional rights regime, that just in general in this country. And if we actually cared about human rights, we might be a very different place for people to live.
So one more. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, for those of you who've had abortions, I love you so much. Whenever you're ready and you want to share your story, we're here for you. And for those of you who haven't yet or will support someone, think about how you're going to be open to listening to their story or supporting someone during an abortion. Because if you prepare now, you'll be ready with your best self when someone needs your support or when you need an abortion yourself.
My last comment is very much not a ARPC or scholar comment. It has been a crap-tastic week in the world of racial justice organizing on this. And I will say it, because I already said the other stuff. and especially doing the kind of work that I do on this campus. And this panel has given me real life. Thank you. You all are amazing, and I feel incredibly honored to have been part of this. So thank you all.
So we're going to have, feel free to help yourself to the reception. DC Abortion Fund is going to jump in the middle, tell you a little bit about themselves. I think this panel set them up particularly well, but I want to give people an opportunity to get some food, get some drink, and then we'll pull back out.
I see you.
Thank you so much. And I'll definitely be emailing you. Please do whatever back to DC. I'd love to get coffee.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would love that. I would like that. It's good to see you in real life. Renee. Let's get this going. Oh my gosh, you're so nice.